Good morning. Welcome to Free Markets. I'm Mike Beitler, your host. I believe big government is the problem and a free market is the solution. Let me go ahead and jump right in and introduce today's guest. My guest today is Dr. Robert Bradley, Jr. Dr. Bradley is the author of Capitalism at Work, which is the first book in a trilogy called Political Capitalism. His earlier books include Oil, Gas, and Government and The Mirage of Oil Protection. Rob is the chairman of the Institute for Energy Research in Houston, Texas. Rob is also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute. For 16 years, Rob was employed by Enron, where for the last 7 years he was the corporate director for public policy analysis and speechwriter for Ken Lay. In 2002, Dr. Bradley received the Julian L. Simon Memorial Award for his work on free market approaches to energy sustainability. Rob, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Mike.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here. I've really enjoyed your book, as you know. I was going to ask you, Rob, you have a really interesting story. So even before we get to your book, tell us a little bit about your path to free market capitalism and your experiences at Enron.
Sure, I'll try to summarize it. I first became interested in free market ideas in high school. I came from a conservative family where conservative politics were discussed at the dinner table. But an important moment in my development was reading a book in the summer before my senior year of high school that was on the required reading list, and it was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And I wasn't an avid reader, but I remember distinctly propped up in my bed and reading the first sentence of the first page of the book. Howard Rourke laughed, and I read that book cover to cover, and it really impressed upon me the value of individualism. And so from that start, I became very interested in free market economics, beginning with Henry Hazlitt and going on to Ludwig von Mises and later F.A. Hayek. And that was in college. I became very interested in free market economics. I pursued a graduate study in economics, got a master's in economics and a PhD in political economy. And about the same time, I applied to the Cato Institute to write a history of oil and gas regulation, and that got me very focused on energy. And from that, I became very interested in the worldview and the writings of the late Julian Simon. So energy sustainability, looking at questions of depletion, pollution, and climate change is a big focus of my current research.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting reading list you just shared there. I think all my listeners ought to read Ayn Rand and Henry Hazlitt, and see who else did you have there? F.A. Hayek and Mises. That's a great reading list, Rob.
Yes, and I heard that some 70% of us that are very interested in free market ideas began with Ayn Rand. Some have remained committed objectivists, but a lot of us have gone into different directions. And the part of my biography that I didn't mention was getting in the energy industry and working for 16 years at Enron and going through the artificial boom and the decisive bust of Enron sort of brought me back to the ideas of Ayn Rand and how to interpret a political entrepreneur like Ken Lay has been difficult for a lot of people, but for me, the worldview of objectivism helped me understand Enron in general and Ken Lay in particular as a philosophical fraud prosecutable fraud being another question.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and we'll certainly be talking some more today about Ken Lay and your experiences with Enron. Rob, I was thinking, as you know, I wrote a review for your Capitalism at Work book, which will be appearing in the Freeman probably in the next few months here. And one thing I said, Rob, in the review is that, you could have taken advantage of your position, your former position at Enron, and written some cheap expose about the collapse of Enron and the fall of Ken Lay, and probably sold a lot of books. But what I really admired about your book, Rob, is that you talked about bigger systemic problems that are beyond Enron, beyond Ken Lay, even beyond the energy industry. So I think it's a great book. And in the book, you use the term political capitalism as you saw it in the energy industry. Are we talking here, Rob, about basically the same thing when I talk about crony capitalism? Is that what you're talking about there?
That's very close. And the idea of my book was to present a worldview to understand the rise and fall of Enron. You mentioned that there was some bestseller Enron books that came out very quickly, and I never went in that direction. But what I found out trying to understand this very complicated story is that the reader really needed a whole worldview encompassing philosophy, economics, history, and the other books were really storytelling books, and they're very fun to read, such as Smartest Guys in the Room by Bethany McLean and Peter Elkin. But those storytelling books, they told of all this peculiar behavior, but they didn't really get to the why behind the why. And my Enron book, so to speak, has turned into a trilogy where the first book really presents the worldview of free market capitalism versus its opposite, political capitalism. And back to your question on crony capitalism, that is very close to the term political capitalism. But crony capitalism can also be where in the private sector we just have bad business practices, where you have a board of directors of a company that's far too close to the CEO, where you don't have independence. But there is an overlap of terms. And as far as my term political capitalism, there's a number of other terms that are very close. The corporate state, corporate statism, corporation capitalism. There's probably about 25 terms. And then there's another term, American capitalism, which is very close to political capitalism, and it has some crony capitalism in it, too.
Yeah, interesting. I think what is so interesting, too, about your Capitalism at Work book, Rob, is when you talk about Ken Lay, you don't paint him with this brush of evil, or because I think what you do in the book, and what makes it so interesting, is you're getting to how he became part of the system. I know when you talked about his resume, for example, PhD economist, had just wonderful credentials. But then you talked about he had 3 federal jobs, 2 of those as a regulator in the energy industry. So if we talk about Ken Lay for a moment, Rob, how do you see Ken Lay? Was he a product of the system, or just evil to the core, or how do you think about Ken Lay?
Well, you can't think of Enron without thinking of Ken Lay, because he was a person that put together different companies, which renamed was Enron. He was the architect, and he was chairman from the beginning until the end. And what's unusual here is that in the energy industry, most of the great leaders have technical background in the industry. Or, for example, with ExxonMobil, the smartest company of the oil majors, the CEOs, the leaders of that company are almost all engineers. They have a technological intuition and understanding of the industry, and from there they learn business. There's a saying at ExxonMobil: you can teach an engineer business, but you can't teach a business major engineering. But Ken Lay, his skill set was completely different. PhD economist, interested in the big picture. He didn't have a background in accounting, finance. He never built up a company from scratch. Yet the late Mr. Lay got on top of the business world. And my conclusion is that he only could have done this in a mixed economy. And indeed, Enron's major profit centers had something to do with government intervention, regulatory change. So my working hypothesis is that in a true free market economy, unlike what we have had, Ken Lay would have been unknown to history, or Ken Lay, who is a real smart man and driven man, would have had to have had a different skill set. He would have had to have gotten a degree in engineering or taken a lot more accounting and finance classes to get to the top.
Yeah, Rob, let me jump in there because I want to come back right after the break and talk a little bit more about Ken Lay and the mixed economy. I think you're bringing up some great points there. So for this short break here, before we go to that, let me tell you, you're listening to Free Markets. I'm Mike Beitler, your host. I'm speaking today with Dr. Robert Bradley, the author of Capital. Welcome back to the second segment of Free Markets. I'm Mike Beitler, your host. My guest today is Dr. Robert Bradley. He is the author of Capitalism at Work. And before the break, we were pulling back the curtain at Enron and looking behind the scenes, and Rob was telling us a little bit about his take on Ken Lay. And before the break, Rob, you brought up the term mixed economy, which some of my listeners are probably familiar with, but can you talk a little bit about the mixed economy and how you saw it playing out at Enron?
Sure. Well, the mixed economy, also known as the third way, is an economic system that's somewhere between pure capitalism and the planned economy. And the mixed economy, as we have gotten to know it in the U.S., it has often been led by business initiatives, businesses trying to get a special favor from government, whether it's a particular regulation, a tax provision, or a subsidy. And in American history, for example, a tariff against imported products from abroad is an example of political capitalism where there's a particular business interest, a particular industry that's lobbying the government to get that intervention to help their bottom line. Now, not all intervention in the economy comes from direct business support. Now there's a plurality of forces. We might call it special interest capitalism, where other organized groups, whether it's for the environment, labor, gender, there's a variety of special interests that can be behind government intervention. Now, interestingly, there's a term that maybe your listeners have heard, bootleggers and Baptists, and this is where a business interest teams up with a reformer interest to get a particular government intervention. such as an environmental group, let's say, getting together with all the wind power companies to promote a mandate for renewable energy in the United States. But Enron thrived in the mixed economy because if you look at Enron's profit centers, virtually all of them had something to do with special government favor. And this is where Ken Lay's skill set came into play because he was very smart, driven. He was a great people person. He had what Ayn Rand called Washington ability. And indeed, if you look at Atlas Shrugged, it's sort of the second-hander company. It matches up very well to Enron.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That just hit me there, Rob. So when you think about Atlas Shrugged, how would you Ken Lay would be which character in there? Is there a particular character?
Oh, I should know that off the top of my head. I think it'd be James Taggart, okay. Someone that has a company trying to stay in good with government, trying to be all things to all people, in a company that sort of works from the outside in rather than the inside out. You know, a good, sustainable free market company is where the CEO isn't out giving speeches and isn't taking the plane to Washington. That CEO is inside the walls of his or her own building, dealing with the nitty-gritty of profit loss and how to serve consumers and how to retain and attract the best employees, all of those things. But Ken Lay was something quite different, and my primary job at Enron was writing speeches for Ken Lay, putting together presentations, because Ken Lay was always on the road talking to well, he had a lot of talks in Washington, D.C., but he had a variety of talks in the U.S. and around the world trying to create an image of Enron as the company of the future in order to sort of hike the Enron stock. But he was spending so much time on external matters and on the image that he lost sight of what was happening inside his company, and necessary mid-course corrections never got made.
Yeah, and that's interesting, Rob. So if we look at a bigger picture here, what's your take on this? In a mixed economy, well, are we going to naturally have more Ken Lay types, not just in energy,